Well, I'm back for the Life of a Showgirl, and I have to say this has been the most interesting album review process I've had since I jumped into the world of Taylor Swift back in late 2022. Back then, I reviewed all of her records up through Midnights in one big run, one album after the other, and I got to watch this incredible, bewildering roller coaster unfold with twists and turns in unexpected thematic and sonic directions, playing through her entire catalog essentially on fast forward compared to the experience that most of her fans had following her slowly over the years, getting older and growing alongside the albums. And then the Tortured Poets Department came out, and it was this absolutely megalithic project by any possible measure. An entire diary spilled out into song with such scattered themes and ideas across it that I felt like it could only be understood as this massive chunk of raw, barely processed ore to be poured over for weeks and weeks searching for all the veins of gold woven within. The Life of a Showgirl is, in a lot of ways, the exact opposite kind of record. The shortest album of her career, accounting for the deluxe edition tracks on debut, intensely colorful in contrast to the Tortured Poet Department's grayscale, Max Martin and Shellback's pop-first songwriting is very different to Jack Antonoff and Aaron Dessner's kind of atmospheric, vibe-first production style. It's incredibly happy and often even a little straightforward in times, in contrast to the tortured, depressive Rat's Nest. It's an entirely different kind of experience. And silly as it might seem, I found myself slightly worried about that. I know many people have expressed tiring of Jack's production style, but I really like it. I know many people found the Tortured Poets Department too rambling and too esoteric, but I kind of like those things about it. My favorite Taylor songs are often quite melancholic and even a little experimental, and this album was not really poised to have anything like that on it. Despite how much I've loved Taylor's whole catalog, and despite how clearly upward the trajectory of my opinion on her records has been, I set my expectations pretty low going into this album. And I've got to say, on the whole, after spending some time with it, I'm pretty relieved. And I'm going to go through track by track to explain why. So from the time this tracklist was first announced, there was an obvious contradiction in the opening track's title, referring to this tragic, needless, possibly self-inflicted demise of Ophelia, who was lovesick and haunted by familial collapse, and what everyone anticipated this album to be, which was a very rare example of a Taylor record about being in what, by all accounts, appears to be a really healthy and happy relationship, maybe the healthiest and happiest of her life. Taylor resolves this contradiction in the first 30 seconds of this song, and in so doing, she establishes a theme that really runs throughout this whole record, which is this dialectic of fate, where Taylor sees proverbial paths diverging in the woods and contemplates the fortunes that awaited her down each of them. I've discussed extensively in my reviews of her previous records the ways in which Taylor's songs often have two layers of meaning. There's a facade, and then there's a deeper truth beneath. And while I think in many ways this record is a bit more straightforward in its meaning and intentions than her other records since maybe Lover, this recurring theme of divergent timelines carves a second facet into almost every track here, by which we can understand not just the path that she did choose, which is generally framed as a path of triumph and love and salvation, but also the implications of her fixation on the alternative. That is to say, The Fate of Ophelia is a song about being saved by love, but in just the same way, it's a song about a very dark fear of where her life had been leading her up until the point of that salvation. Taylor vis-a-vis Ophelia was an eldest daughter, and we're going to come back to that later in the album. She lived in fantasy and yet drowned in the melancholy, deceived, her sanity stolen by a cold bed of scorpions, which is the metaphor for her attempts at love. Stretching the parallels with Ophelia in a more thematic, less textually accurate direction, she depicts herself as having been sat alone in her tower, buried alive, locked inside her own memories, all culminating in the belief that she was destined to be heartbroken, alone, and lamenting love lost right to the very end of her days. And the last time we've heard her talk like that was on I Hate It Here, which is one of the saddest songs in her whole catalog. For a triumphant track about salvation and a leper lighting up her skies, and we'll come back to that imagery later too, that's awfully heavy. When Taylor has interpolated Shakespeare in the past, and this is the second tragic heroine that she saved from their bitter fate, she had merely borrowed names and imagery. But here some 70 or 80% of the lyrics are dedicated to the dark timeline of canon, and as a result a much bleaker image is painted of where Taylor found herself over these preceding years. And it's in understanding this that we really begin to understand the thesis of the album, which, from a little of the opinions I've allowed myself to see of this record online, seems to have been frequently missed. Taylor described this record as a peek behind the curtain of her life during the Eras tour, as like a glimpse into the dressing room of the smiling and sequined titular showgirl. And from what I've seen, some people have been left feeling as though this record doesn't do that, but I disagree. While Taylor's life may have made a turn for the positive, and it would be dishonest to depict anything less than that, the feeling that she was destined for one of the most heartbreaking fates in all of literature is nothing if not a revelation of a layer of looming darkness and pain which had been masked by the glamour and joy of this massively exultant and lucrative and celebratory event like the Eras Tour. Taylor was exuding joy and light on that stage every night, living in something as close to a fantasy as any of us could probably imagine, and yet in the midst of this, she saw visions of herself falling from a willow into a cold brook, beyond saving, alone. Now, all of that aside, I don't want to undersell the salvation here. With Ophelia's death by water, Taylor plays with the contrasting metaphor of her savior as a pyro who lights a match and pulls her into the flames. This immediately brought to mind the previous times in which she's compared someone in a relationship to a fire, namely in Peace, when Taylor volunteers to be the fire to keep her partner's brittle heart warm. In turning that and now framing Travis as her fire, Taylor reveals that her current relationship allows her to be the vulnerable one, sheltered by her partner rather than the other way around. And this is a theme that resurfaces a few times on this record, namely on track 5, but we'll get there. Musically, well, yeah, that's Max Martin and Shellback, alright. Percussion and synths at the top of the mix, a really sticky chorus, everything going quiet before a big drop hits, etc. That's pretty much what I anticipated for this record, and that's what we got on the opening track. I'm also always a fan of when Taylor goes into her lower register a little bit, and when she allows that slight rasp her voice has developed over the past few years to come through, and we get both of those in moments here. The former particularly on the bridge and the outro, and the latter on See It All and Ophelia, which conclude the fourth bars in their respective choruses. I don't think it's the most exciting production or the catchiest hook that this trio has ever brewed up. It's pretty good though. These people are world-class experts at writing catchy songs, and that's what they've done here. It's just not maybe my all-time favorite. I think the back half of the chorus is stronger than the front half, which reminds me of King of My Heart in more ways than one. And whenever this song is inevitably played at a live performance one day, you already know that the crowd is going to be clapping along with a chain, a crown, a vine, and I'm always in favor of more crowd participation cues. I find that really adorable. There's also this curious and subtle 1960s Britpop quality to the melody here, and that's going to turn out to be a bit of a theme we're going to be revisiting on like half of the tracks on this record. I'm not exactly sure if the 1960s and Showgirls have some inherent connection. Certainly there were Showgirls before the 1960s, but at least for the aesthetics of this record there is one, and I think it's executed super well here and everywhere else on the record too. All things considered, it's a really fun opening track, and I totally get why she picked it as the lead single. The underlying tragic thread of the Fate of Ophelia can't really be understood without at least some passing knowledge of Hamlet, and the second track, Elizabeth Taylor, asks even more of the reader in order to really grok what Taylor's putting down. So for the youths out there, a little bit of vital context. Liz Taylor was a strong contender for the biggest film star of the 1960s, and look, we're already back to this 1960s theme on the record. But beyond being about as critically and commercially acclaimed as anyone possibly could be, her personal life was the subject of tremendous public interest and scrutiny, with her most famous affair even earning her an explicit condemnation from the Vatican. Liz was famous from a very early age. She had 2 failed engagements before proceeding to get married 8 times to 7 different men, several of whom were very prominent media figures themselves who didn't exactly enjoy the spotlight that they were in next to her. Liz's 2 most famous marriages were both to actor Richard Burton, beginning with a proposal at Portofino in 1964, and in the early 1970s the two spent 6 months living at the Hotel Plaza Athénée in Paris. Liz lived in New York for a time. Her eyes were famously described as violet. She and Burton purchased a 68-carat Cartier diamond necklace which she wore to several public events. They, alongside just about everybody else in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s, frequented Musso and Frank's, one of LA's most iconic restaurants, and her famous signature perfume is called White Diamonds. If that feels like I just described like 90% of the lyrics to this track, yeah, pretty much. If it also feels like the vast majority of what I just described, fame from an early age, critical and commercial acclaim, tempered by intense media scrutiny and controversy, numerous highly publicized failed relationships, often with partners who didn't love the limelight, a signature look, a signature scent, applied just as well to Taylor as they do to Liz, then yeah, pretty much. This isn't the first time that Taylor has played with this parallel. Burton to my Taylor and Ready For It, of course. And it's only become a more apt comparison as the years have gone on. Whereas the first track was closer to 20% celebration of love, here we only have kind of a sliver of that. Just this subtle hint that there's a current partner that she loves, the hints of desiring a proposal, and the hope that she's invested into her new lover, while nearly the entire track is dedicated to the darker fate of Elizabeth Taylor. This track could just as easily be called The Fate of Taylor, as at its core it really does the same thing as the previous track. It depicts a fear of an alternate timeline in which Taylor's love affairs all falter, and despite the certainty and conviction of various relationships being the real one, final one, the one that will last, inevitably they all meet the same fate. Liz Taylor ended up spending the last decade of her life unmarried. There was no final happily ever after relationship for her, despite the fact that all of her lovers lasted forever in the papers and on the screen and in the public's minds. For a record released in the light of the first engagement of Taylor's life, a repeated reference to a woman whose marriages all failed without exception, followed by the question, do you think it's forever, is a really heavy and solemn message. If the Fate of Ophelia left us feeling that Taylor has been saved and all the fears of despair and solitude have been cast off, well, Elizabeth Taylor brings that line of thinking into question at the very least. Is Taylor really forging ahead fearlessly? She's certainly carrying the scars of relationships past, that's for sure. She seems to understand that her personal story to this point would imply her belief that a new relationship relationship feel so different and special and promising is by no means a guarantee of anything. That being said, I think this song's placement so early in the track list suggests that perhaps these concerns are no longer with Taylor now, but instead were a part of the early days of her relationship, to essentially be supplanted by some of the much more optimistic and confident songs to come. But I think it's fair to read it differently. Lyrically, there isn't a whole lot more to explore here than that as far as I can tell. This song kind of has a single core metaphor that it leans into the whole way through. The music and melodic progressions take a darker turn here to match the greater emphasis of the bleak fatalism of the lyrics, and the result is really the only track on the record without some light tempering the shadow. The production here is a bit punchier and bolder than the Fate of Ophelia, a bit more reputation coded, and that feels perfectly appropriate. That said, of all the choruses on the record, this was the one that took me the longest to come around to. It was really that number one, number two bit that slowly wormed its way into my ear. But on the whole, I think it's perhaps the least sticky and memorable chorus on the album for me. I've expressed before my affection for when Taylor mixes in very particular vocal deliveries for certain words or phrases, and in this track the delivery of thanks really scratches my brain in just the right way. On the other hand, I have perhaps a strange, not entirely justifiable dislike for opening the track with just singing Elizabeth Taylor and allowing that to linger. Starting any song with a title is always a little too on the nose for my taste, but something about it being a person's name really kind of multiplies that effect for me. I just found myself wishing she hadn't done that. But overall, those are all kind of small gripes for what I think is a track that is still in no way a skip for me. Track 3, and I've got to start with the music on this one. This is what I had been hoping for. Sonically, when Taylor said that she, Max, and Shellback have been honing their skills over the years since they last worked together, this is the kind of result that I was hoping we would get. This is an earworm to rival any in Taylor's whole catalog. They absolutely crushed it with the chorus of Opalite. The instrumentation here is also a substantial switch up from the previous two kind of synth and percussion heavy tracks, with this fuzzy, washed out, half muted guitar serving as the foundation of the sound. And there's something very dreamy and even slightly psychedelic about it, more of that kind of colorful, paisley, kaleidoscopic vibe that psychedelic music started to adopt when it was worked into the mainstream, which is perfectly matched with the chorus and once again a 1960s feel. Those descending oh-oh-oh-ohs have a real ABBA-like quality to them. Think Waterloo, and of course note that Max, being a fellow Swede and songwriting genius, I'm sure he's very familiar with what makes ABBA tick. And then those raising vocals that join around at the end of the bridge feel very doo-wop and immediately made me think of the Isley Brothers' Twist and Shout. I've got a huge amount of affection and nostalgia for that era of music, and everything about this chorus just works so well for me. Beyond the production and the melodies, I'm also happy that Taylor is again in a slightly lower register for the verses here, and I think it just works really well to contrast the high chorus. Now lyrically, this feels like the final part of kind of an opening trilogy. So if the Fate of Ophelia lays out the two paths that Taylor saw for herself, ultimately believing she's been saved from the worst of the two, and Elizabeth Taylor is the lingering fears that carried on in spite of that, Opalite is the celebration in spite of those fears, or perhaps even their overcoming. We open again with the same central theme of the last two tracks of past lovers and failed relationships and the implications that echo beyond them, and shout out to Austin for the line eating out of the trash. That's completely gold. And with references back to Taylor's recurring theme of being haunted by ghosts, which is obviously seen in Haunted, Death by a Thousand Cuts, Midnight Rain, Would've, Could've, Should've, Anti-Hero, Florida, How Did It End, and a bunch more that I'm sure I'm forgetting. Taylor also seems to have maybe a little bit of resentment for the notion of when you know you know. And to throw back to Liz Taylor, clearly it's more complicated than that, right? Not to mention that this line is also likely a double reference to the Bleachers' Margaret, given that that's a perfect couple in Taylor's life. But clearly you can think you know and still be wrong. And the people in her life, just as much as the whole often resentful public, have often seen her be wrong before, and she says so herself. I was wrong. And it's just then, as though struck with a newfound clarity and certainty, the past tense in which this song had been written at this point clicks into the present for just a single line, saying of the previously onyx night above her, but now the sky is opalite, playing with the contrast of two gemstones, one black and white, not unlike Reputation or the Torture Pose department, and another man-made and iridescent, while simultaneously she returns to this metaphor of lighting up her skies from the opener. Now, I'll confess to not entirely understanding what's happening with the opening lines of the second verse. I'm sure someone with more knowledge of the deep lore will chime in to tell me, well, of course, the person who was in the phone was such and such, but for now, I gather that in much the same way the opening verse summarizes Taylor's past leading up to her current relationship, the second verse probably is intended to do the same for Travis's past. That may or may not be the case, but for now, I'm inclined to believe the "you finally left the table" is probably playing with the same symbolism as "right where you left me" and "tolerate it," symbolism which she may very well be extending to someone other than herself. At any rate, my favorite chorus on the record, followed by my favorite bridge to this point on the record, it brings this newfound perspective on overcoming obstacles in a healthier way, just as it soars into the sky with these swelling voices that really do make you want to say, "Shig it a baby now." I also have to mention that Genius, as of the time of this writing and recording at least, has incorrectly transcribed the lyrics of the final chorus of the song, which, per the album liner, switched from Taylor's mom saying, "never made no one like you before," as in "They broke the mold when they made you," to Taylor herself saying never met no one like you before, which is a classic Taylor move. You gotta love that. Someone who knows how, go fix that on Genius. Anyway, in my opinion, this one is the purest bop on the record and a track that very much deserves to be the second single and ideally the second music video from this album. I love this track. So for track 4, I knew going into this track that there was going to be an interpolation of George Michael's father figure. And so I was expecting it to open with a sound similar to that, maybe something like Guilty as Sin with that like Blue Nile inspired soft rock synth pop. But instead we open up with this huge sizzling drum synth that reminded me more of something like Ricky Eat Acid's Beautiful Girls. It's really assertive and heavy and almost lo-fi. And this is the correct precedent to set for this track. This song borrows the key melody and the title from George Michael, but it deviates dramatically from it in nearly every other way. And I'm okay with that, because to my mind this is probably the most lyrically sophisticated track on the record, and a lot of that begins with the consistent use of I and you pronouns, despite a slow and dramatic change in tone as the track evolves, leaving us to ask, hey, wait, sorry, whose perspective are we hearing exactly? Where does Taylor fit into all of this? Many of my favorite Taylor lyrics, like the ones we occasionally got on Folklore, Evermore, and the Tortured Poets department, do precisely this. They blur the line between characters, between autobiography and storytelling. We open with this powerful prodigal figure, someone who thinks they can win in a proverbial deal with the devil for reasons that Taylor describes in unexpectedly phallic terms for not the last time on this record. And they take this protege under their wing in what seems like an act of benevolence, but with the predatory implications of language like, just step into my office. It's quickly revealed that their love is pure profit. The figure assures their mentee that they can leave it with them, their family now, and they protect their family, a phrase which evokes a very kind of mafioso Don Corleone imagery. Taylor declines to elaborate on what the it being left in the figure's care is exactly, but it's difficult not to imagine that this is in reference to Taylor leaving the ownership of her masters in the hands of her former label head Scott Borchetta, who just happens to also own a company that makes a brown liquor. So, yeah. Where things get really interesting is over the subsequent verse and bridge, though, where the father figure's identity seems to transform. As they say, they want to see you rise, they don't want to see you reign. It brings to mind a sentiment which Taylor has expressed multiple times in tracks like Clara Bow, calling into question whether Taylor herself has maybe ascended to the role of this titular father figure. And when in the bridge the father figure addresses the protege as my dear boy, we know for sure that something is transformed here. There are a few possible interpretations of what's happening on this track, and I'm actually a big fan of the fact that it's left opaque, but my personal interpretation is that the boy's foolish decision to get rid of the father figure reflects a reversal in the power dynamics between Scott and Taylor. As Taylor became an even bigger force in the world than the man who thought he controlled her and found her, he, framed as a boy here, decided to sell her masters in an act of thoughtless ambition. And Taylor brings this interpretation home with the highly revised final chorus in which she says, she's the devil with whom the deal was made. It turns out her dick's bigger. It turns out this empire belongs to her. She has ascended to the throne he once thought to be securely his own. And now, in a reversal of meaning from the first verse, she repeats, you remind me of a younger me, I saw potential, suggesting that he only serves as a reminder of her youthful mistakes and the misplaced optimism she had for their relationship. And I love the twisting of this exact same phrase, which seemed so straightforward earlier in the track, to have this totally different, almost exactly opposite meaning. While on one hand this is an achievement for Taylor, on the other hand, she frames herself in very much the same light as the person she was condemning, potentially coloring an otherwise victorious narrative with a tinge of self-criticism. Now that said, I don't think Taylor thinks she's gone through a full, become the thing you sought to destroy arc, but I do get the sense that she's keenly aware of the power that she wields, and at the very least, the delicate responsibility it entails. I love the interpolation of the George Michael chorus, and I think Max Shellback and Taylor managed to take a really catchy melody and make it hit way, way harder than it did in the original. No shade to George Michael. The chorus is just so richly layered with backing vocals. The bridge opens with this really fun 80s sitcom harp glissando, and I'm always a fan of double choruses and key changes, and we get both of those with the final chorus on this track. It's just a killer. I've discussed how this album is not purely joyous and celebratory and how there are actually some darker underlying themes in most of the tracks, but if anything's indicative of the fact that in spite of that, this is still the happiest record of Taylor's career, it's the choice of Eldest Daughter as the record's track 5. Now this song has plenty of emotional weight to it, don't get me wrong, and I suspect that that weight is felt much more keenly by Eldest Daughters out there than it could possibly be by me. But thinking back on her last few track 5s, The Archer, My Tears Ricochet, Tolerate It, You're on Your Own Kid, So Long London, this is a far cry from the emotional intensity of any of those. Across her whole catalog, Eldest Daughter strikes me as probably second only to Delicate on the gentlest, heaviest gut punch track 5 scale. And I'd argue that it's not actually the hardest hitting track on this very record. Taylor has strong feelings about keyboard warriors and comment sections, and it's very understandable that she does. She is one of the most prominent public figures on the planet, in a time when more people than ever have the ability to make their opinions about anyone known to the entire world. And we could get into a lengthy discussion about all of her incredible privilege, and Taylor has never totally shied away from acknowledging that, and has repeatedly clarified that in spite of everything, she would still choose her life and is still grateful for it above all else. But she's a human being in spite of that, and I don't think any person in her position would be capable of developing zero resentment for internet commenters. That being said, I appreciate that lyrics like the ones that open this track are exceptionally tricky to do well. I recall seeing quite a few people who dislike the Lake's use of the word tweet, and I suspect that trolling and memes will provoke the same responses in those people. Much in the same way that cell phones still haven't really made their way into prestigious serious films, language rooted in the internet feels like it's somehow not permitted to be used in art that's attempting to be taken seriously and withstand the test of time. Personally, Taylor's music has always struck me as very up its day, timely as much as or more than timeless, and so I've really got no qualms with this kind of verbiage. But the discussion of cold-hearted internet commenters really is just there to serve as a brief frame for the real heart of this track, which is a grand narrative of Taylor's life in which her childhood conditioned her towards feigning toughness, coolness, and strength, culminating in her current relationship finally allowing her to drop these facades and be a truer, more vulnerable version of herself. Much like several of the tracks on this record so far, one can focus on the triumph. The bridge depicts her current relationship in this intensely saccharine, beautiful light, Ferris wheels, kisses, and lilacs, a beautiful life that shimmers innocent light back. But one can just as well focus on the implications of what that triumph overcame, which I think is the more interesting dimension of the narrative. Taylor flips around the idiom of a wolf in sheep's clothing, describing herself as being dressed up as a wolf, diagnosing herself with the terminal condition of perpetually trying to be cooler than she is, and cynical about anything that seems to be innocently happy, including relationships, suspecting them to be doomed to cause her harm in the end. The chorus's axis is really right in its opening lines, but I'm not a bad bitch, and this isn't savage. Taylor has produced multiple songs whose thesis is essentially I am a bad bitch, e.g. vigilante shit, or I don't need any support, like you're on your own, kid. And here she's telling us that that persona is really just a reflection in the mirror ball, a facade born out of her earliest years, and that she's got a soft and nougaty center, which she would prefer to be able to show if only she had the comfort to do so. And now, finally, it seems like she does. So if we were left with any concerns after listening to Father Figure that Taylor herself might be transforming into the very thing she sought to overcome, the sequencing of these tracks kind of serves to assure us that this is not the case. Taylor's bigger than the devil's dick energy is a mode that she can switch into, sure, but it's not who she wants to be, and we'll revisit this idea later in the record as well. Beyond that, in much the same way that the content of the lyrics call back to her younger years, so too does the choice of some of the phrasing here. But I'm not a, and this isn't, is a reworking of White Horses, but I'm not a princess and this ain't a fairy tale, which is one of those classic examples of something that's so exciting and revelatory about Taylor's lyrics for someone who's like a card-carrying member of the club, and which one cannot possibly try to describe as evidence of what makes analyzing Taylor's lyrics rewarding to someone who is not. And here we also get like an Opalite what strikes me as a brief allusion to Travis's life as well. Again, those with the deep lore feel free to correct me, but this little inclusion of a reference to the youngest child and the use of you in the final pre-chorus make me believe that to put a bow on this kind of beautiful soaring bridge, Taylor has woven Travis's narrative into her own, suggesting that while his experience was in some ways the opposite of hers, as the youngest instead of the oldest, this relationship is nonetheless the thing that both of them needed, and that's very sweet. Musically, I appreciate the brief intermission from a kind of boom bang Max and Shellback production where we can sit in a little reprieve from the percussion. This track opens with only a piano and Taylor's voice, gently incorporates very subtle synths, and then swells with this warm, softly recorded acoustic guitar that seamlessly takes over at the top of the mix, and it carries the song through the apex as Taylor's backing vocals come through with these sweeping, angelic sighs before it gently drifts it back toward the piano at the very end. It's definitely some of the better production on the record, just for its cleanness and its simplicity. It does what it needs to do, no extra frills, and every part of it plays a role in supporting the vocals, which are obviously delivered with a bit more emotional weight than is warranted by most of the tracks on this record. I'd say the chorus falls into a good, not great category for me, similar to Elizabeth Taylor, where I feel like one half of the chorus is a little bit stronger than the other, like lines 1, 2, and 5 and 6 kind of outshine 3, 4, and 7 and 8 for me, really leaving just kind of 4 lines of hook, but that hook is complemented by just how fun the lyrics on those 4 lines are. But I'm not a bad bitch and this isn't savage, and then so many traitors and smooth operators really stand out, memorable, sing-alongable lines, and the music and vocals combine to conjure a really melancholic, complex emotion that I think works really well too. And then there's just the whole vibe and aesthetic of this song, which just works perfectly for me. So even if the chorus isn't my favorite on the record, the track on the whole still ends up being near the top of my list. The album's theme of pondering on alternate timelines and what could have been if things had taken a different direction continues on Ruin the Friendship. Taylor has raised what-if questions about people from her youth numerous times over the years. 'Tis the Damn Season is perhaps the most obvious one, but there's also the heavier and I think very underrated Forever Winter, and then there's my personal favorite little darling of a track, Dorothea, and this track joins that canon of kind of tragic, nostalgic what-ifs. The very opening line references September, a month which was prominently featured in Taylor's very first single, September Saw a Month of Tears in Tim McGraw, which immediately ties this track all the way back to her youth. And though Tim McGraw's Chevy truck has been swapped for a Jeep here, clearly we're still in the same aesthetic territory, Taylor's high school stomping grounds around Nashville. Similarly, the focus on the smile and the prom that come through in the first chorus and the second verse seem to loosely tie back to You Belong With Me, which covers similar themes in both the lyrics and the music video. Whether any of these allusions are meant to tell us the subject of these songs is the same or not, I'm not sure. Taylor may well just be borrowing metaphors and feelings from her earliest records to build a certain kind of atmosphere. But at any rate, like the previous track, we're following a theme of connecting threads between Taylor's current life and her younger formative years. And appropriately for the aforementioned collection of songs to which this belongs, Taylor's fairly lighthearted reminiscing about the relationship she might have had if she'd merely taken that leap of faith takes a much more tragic turn after the conclusion of what seems like an innocently simple and catchy bridge. All of a sudden, the guitar fades out to just a few sparse drums as Taylor recounts that Abigail, another prominent figure in her earliest songs, called her with the bad news, followed by a lingering goodbye, and we'll never know why. The chorus returns in a far quieter, more solemn way as Taylor rewrites it to recount flying home with so much left to say, which she could only whisper at the grave. Nothing about Taylor's vocal delivery or word choice here leads me to believe that this is intended as metaphor or symbolism. And right around when I realized that, this track managed to hit me in the heart in a way that no other song, including track 5, did on this record. Forever Winter has always had a dagger in my side, and Taylor's voice breaking ever so slightly on the final Kissed before the instrumentation comes back through twists a very similar kind of knife. The outro in which Taylor turns her focus towards the fourth wall and expresses her regrets for all time, that she'll always be asking this question all her life, not exactly a salve on the wound. For me at least, it's the most emotionally effective moment on the record, and while I think Eldest Daughter does fit appropriately after Father Figure, this is the one that feels like the spiritual track 5 in my book. As for the musical side of things, we're clearly still riding that wave of 60s inspiration with clean, airy guitar reminiscent of Lord's Solar Power, which itself was a very kind of 60s flower power throwback, and then that funky driving bass line recalls the likes of like the Jackson 5's I Want You Back. And the two just make a really effective combination that creates one of my overall favorite sonic palettes on the album. This song succeeds in making the verses, choruses, and bridge all pretty much equally catchy and addictive, which is a really rare feat, and one made possible by the way Taylor's vocals follow the lead of the stellar instrumentation. The production choices across the board here, like those quiet, spaced guitar strums after the bridge before the bass crawls back in through the mix, and then that little drum fill leading to the full instrumentation coming back, that whole section just works especially well, and it also happens to be the section with the most lyrically and vocally impactful moments on the song. So consequently, the back half of this track in particular is one of the overall high water marks of the whole album for me, and I think really reflects Taylor, Max, and Shellback combining their powers at maximum effectiveness, and perhaps most interestingly, doing so in a way that is pretty far from what at least I would have imagined that would look like, which is really cool. Okay, so let's establish something from the start here just to clear the elephant out of the room, because I'm sure by the time anyone is listening to this, it's already become a massive topic of discussion. This song is not a direct and singular response to Sympathy as a Knife. We know as objectively and undeniably as possible that it is not, from the very first line of this track. The opening allegation laid out in the first 7 words of the track is very explicit and it's very clear, and it's also not something which is said, implied, or suggested in that song. And so whatever and whoever this song is addressing, it is something which goes beyond anything to which I have any access. Whatever Taylor is saying someone said or did toward her, I have no way of verifying whether it's true, but the one thing I do know definitively is that it's not something that is said or done in that song. Everyone is obviously free to have their opinions on whether the song is entirely about Charlie, or not about Charlie at all, or about multiple people. I don't know. And to the extent of my knowledge, I don't think any of us know. But I do think there's an interpretation of this track which is much broader than being exclusively about one person or group of people, and that is also much more interesting and in line with the themes of this record. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about. Taylor is no stranger to the I'll use your hate as fuel and I'm living rent-free inside your head mindsets, dating all the way back to Mean and I Bet You Think About Me. And this track feels very much like a natural successor to those songs, where Taylor takes spite or pain or heartbreak and says, I can turn that in my favor. I can prove you wrong. But here, coming just a few tracks after Eldest Daughter, it's also very much established in this very text that Taylor's kind of carefree mob boss, unhurt Ironton persona is just that. It is a persona that she puts on. It's the showgirl front, it's the wolf costume, the shield that she's learned to put up to deflect and redirect the things that hurt her in order to propel her forward. She's not really deep down exclusively and naturally those things. And in that sense, the track that I'm most reminded of here is Blank Space. Not that this is true satire, but that she's playing a bit of dress up, putting on the costume of the untouchable queen who responds to her hate mail with thanks honey XOXO, or like the MMA fighter who blows a little kiss to his opponent just to get under his skin. And like all good characters, it's obviously got to be grounded in a certain amount of truth. Large and containing multitudes, Taylor can simultaneously be soft and affected and sensitive, and also capable of switching into a mode in which her dick is bigger than the devil's, in which she can brush off any criticism, and neither of those really need to be the one and only true version of herself. You don't write a song to your hate haters if they don't affect you somewhat, but importantly, that doesn't mean that any of her feelings here, her kind of feels like you're flirting with me approach, is disingenuous. Both can be true at the same time. And so here again we see, though a bit more masked and subtle than in some of the other tracks, the same theme of two versions of Taylor. One, the Taylor from whose perspective this whole song is written, and then the other, the Taylor who was compelled to write this song in the first place. And in case this wasn't evident, Taylor drops a lovely in the final chorus, a word which she will later in this album tell us that she thinks is often used in a backhanded way. So a truly 100% unfazed, unbothered person probably doesn't decide to throw that in there. It's more complicated than that. Now, the crowd is your king is a phrase that Taylor has used a few times when discussing this album, and yet Taylor herself acknowledges on this record, as she has elsewhere, that the crowd can't really be one. Or at least not for very long. The cycle is inevitable. They demand you bare your soul before them in utter authenticity and sincerity, and then they shame and boo you when your truest self doesn't perfectly reflect back to them everything they've projected onto you. They ask for more elaborate lyricism, and then they say you wrote too much. They ask for more big pop hits, and then they say you no longer write the elaborate songs that we used to love. Even people who won't listen to her music at all, won't hear a single word she says, will decide that they hate her and will spend their time on the internet posting TikToks and Instagram reels about how she's awful and how anyone who likes her music is awful too. The masses essentially chant, why can't you just be everything we imagine you are, each of us separately, authentically, all of the time? And yet knowing this, she still says the crowd is your king. Taylor has embraced the fact that hate and disappointment and every possible manner of criticism about what she does and about the art that she makes is an inevitable part of her life, and she still bows before the masses and says, keep it coming, love you. That's the life of a true showgirl. But we'll get more to that later. More than anything, much like Mean and I Bet You Think About Me, and like really so much of Taylor's catalog, very deliberately I think, this song is extremely borrowable by the listener. I know there have been countless people out there over the last decade who have wielded a song like Mean as their own personal anthem towards their haters, and the vibes on this track are even more potent in that regard. Whoever this song might have been about for Taylor, for throngs of people out there, it's going to be the track about those people who talk shit about them in their own lives. And in that sense, I think this track is going to have a very long shelf life. The melody and instrumentation here immediately brought to mind the Pixies' Where Is My Mind, and also a couple of Weezer tracks. There's a little bit of like Say It Ain't So in the intro, and maybe a little bit of Beverly Hills in the chorus, and that's not something I thought I'd ever say about a Taylor Swift song. It's far more rock-oriented than the record has been to this point, which is really a pretty perfect compliment to the energy of the track. I think something more synth-heavy like the rest of the record might have come off a little too serious and reputation-y, maybe even a little bit too much like it was identifying who the song was about, if it even was about that person. On the whole, it's just really a straightforward, classic pop rock instrumentation and production that people as experienced as Max and Shellback were always going to execute flawlessly, and they did that here. And for me, this track also has one of the catchier and more accessible choruses on the record, soon followed by one of the stickiest bridges too, each supported by Taylor's really colorful vocals. This track is littered with those fun little vocal quirks and layers, like the slightly off-cadence backing vocals that come in for It Hurts, and then those huge, almost shouted backing vocals on the second and fourth lines of the bridge, and you have to love the way the mic feedback cuts in to almost bury the final word of the bridge, as though Taylor was like walking up to the line of self-censoring and then didn't with a wink. I just think this track slaps. I really hope it doesn't devolve into nothing more than like a pop culture flashpoint in the minds of her fans, because I don't really think that's a particularly interesting take. I don't think it matches the aesthetics. I don't think it matches the themes that she's going for on this album. I don't think it makes sense to think of it that way. And yet if that does end up being the case, it almost proves her point. And I think Taylor just responds by saying, thank you, can I have another? Moving on to Wishlist and the groove, ladies and gentlemen, the groove. From my recollection, I had much warmer feelings about Glitch than the kind of larger consensus around that song, and I guess, sorry for all the people who didn't vibe with Glitch, because Wishlist very much feels like the aesthetic successor to that track, one of the rare examples of Taylor stepping into kind of an R&B inspired vibe, and I am all about that. It's got the same drop that makes Glitch's choruses work so well, this kind of gentle build-up leading to the really abrupt plunge into the full soundscape, but one that doesn't really break the flow established in the verses. It also brings to mind some of the very few Ariana Grande songs that I really click with, like NASA, which also has that faster cadence of vocals blended with the slower driving beat, which creates something that feels simultaneously really relaxed but also really energetic. And then the back half of the second verse is easily my single favorite moment on the track musically. Those rising, almost eerie minor key backing vocals that play in perfect contrast to the lead melody before they snap into perfect sync for the final line line. That whole section does some black magic to my brain. Like, I need someone with way more musical knowledge than I have to explain to me exactly what's happening there, because it's the musical equivalent of like one of those middle whisk head massagers for me. It just instantly scratches an itch I didn't even realize that I had. It actually may just overall be my favorite single moment on the whole record. From the perspective of music and production, it's pretty hard to top this track for me. I love everything about the decisions they made here. That being said, lyrically, I don't have a whole ton to say about this one, and I don't really think a careful analysis of it reveals that much in the way of complex meaning. Taylor contrasts a list of accolades and accomplishments from Palme d'Ors to a contract with Real Madrid against her humbler desires to simply settle down and have a family with her partner. And in that sense, it very much feels like a sequel to The Prophecy, a track which expressed in far darker and more tragic terms a very similar sentiment, that Taylor would throw everything away for real, true love. And the opening lines of the bridge, "I made wishes on all the stars, please God," strike me as a direct callback to the pleading with the fates on The Prophecy. And mostly from the lyrics, I'm just left feeling happy for her, that it feels like The Prophecy was in fact changed. In a matter of just 18 months since the time we first heard that track, Taylor is now engaged to be married and singing about a future in which she envisions her kids playing basketball in the driveway. That's a hell of a turnaround, and you know, good for her. I'll be enjoying this bop with my wife and my cat, and Taylor, you go do you, girl. One of my first thoughts listening to Ruin the Friendship was how the bass line reminded me of the Jackson Five's I Want You Back. And then Wood comes on, and maybe it's just because it's in my mind, but man, it really feels like the I Want You Back little half-muted guitar intro that leads into this track. That 60s R&B meets Scandinavian pop energy is all over this record, and here that vibe really amps up and actually carries straight on through the rest of the track, with this very kind of funk, Motown, almost disco-adjacent cadence of the pre-choruses, which are easily my favorite part of the track. But I'll admit I've been a little. That slow fast delivery turns up those funk vibes, a slightly off-kilter, almost Stevie Wonder-esque complexity to the melody. It's one of those bits that makes me feel like I've heard it before, and yet I'm pretty sure I haven't. I think it's just this trio of songwriters doing the shit that these three people can do, and it feels like one of the best examples on the record of these three coming together and merging their talents to do something really musically special. Even that super abrupt ending to this track feels very appropriate. There's no need to kind of linger around with an outro to let you digest the emotions of it all. It just comes in, it does its thing, and it gets out. Taylor's vocals all across the song are also just absolutely wild. There's so many sighs and ums and little twists and tweaks on words, and it feels like she's moving the spotlight around onto all these double entendres that are littered throughout. And on that note, yeah, this whole song is just double entendres. They're everywhere. There's no real need to parse them out. There's no need to call in Judith Butler for an essay to reveal to us the unconscious phallic implications here. Taylor has very much put each one of them on a platter with her delivery. And I imagine that might rub some people the wrong way. It feels like anytime Taylor reminds the world that she's a fully grown adult human being who swears and has a sex life, there's a little bit of pushback to that from a certain crowd. But I don't know, I mostly just think it's really funny here. Like, new heights of manhood? That's just really fun, and the whole vibe of this song is just so lighthearted, musically and lyrically. It deserves a no gripe for that. And for anyone who felt like the Torture Post Department was such a serious and erudite record that was too far up its own literary referential ass, well, we've gone to the far opposite corner, so I hope this is what you wanted. The only thing about the lyrics here that I think is meant to be taken with any real seriousness is the discussion of superstitions and luck and the wishing on a falling star, which again strike me as a natural follow-up to Wishlist in that it addresses the prophecy. Taylor clearly had a long-standing feeling that she was in some way cursed, and much like she was focused on the symbolism of Opalite as a man-made gemstone, here she writes that she and her partner make their own luck. She feels like the two of them have essentially broken the natural order, cut the thread of the fates, and saved her from doom, a theme that's been running through this record from the first track and which really reaches a climax here. This track is super fun, super groovy, super unlike anything Taylor has ever done before, and I find it not just to be one of the catchier songs on the record, but one of the most exciting and interesting ones, just because it feels like a really novel sonic turn for her to have taken. And I think it's great. And you know, congratulations to Travis for, I guess, well, yeah. Nearly a decade ago, Taylor wrote an album which was in large part a response to being cancelled. And since then, she certainly had her public ups and downs, including, among other things, drawing the ire of the President of the United States. She may be the most popular figure on the planet, and simultaneously may have more people who actively dislike her than anyone else on the planet, perhaps rivaled only by the aforementioned president. If anyone has learned how to navigate public scrutiny, and if anyone knows the ways in which public scrutiny can emerge even when it has no basis in reality, as was the case with the driving event behind the relevant tracks and reputation, it is Taylor Swift. And so it shouldn't be surprising that if she were to see unjust public backlash falling upon one of her friends, like say if one of her friends made a harassment claim with the Civil Rights Department and the alleged perpetrator hired a crisis PR company for a smear campaign and attempted to subpoena Taylor, or if one of her friends was going through an extremely public breakup and being vilified by the media as a terrible partner and mother and literally didn't have somewhere safe to stay, it's only natural that Taylor would respond by saying, "Get in. I got you." Several of the specific lyrics that Taylor uses on this track call back to her multiple previous songs where she's discussed these same issues faced by women in the media, like, "Did you girl boss too close to the sun," recalling the man, or "Did they catch you having far too much fun," harkening back to Nothing New, the scars that she's collected referenced in Thank You Amy, numerous references to Poison and Thorns, everything about Mad Woman, and even a little bit of Clara Bow's story of only getting your brief time in the sun before, to paraphrase father figure, they decide that you're done rising and it's time to stop you from raining. And so here Taylor dons her "I did something bad" / "who's afraid of little old me" persona, playing into the character of an almost sinister leader of the underworld, and assures anyone else facing the same experiences that they're now a part of her club, where she's protecting women's rights and wrongs, and teaching them that a shattered glass is a lot more sharp. Which is all great. But I do have mixed feelings about this track, both lyrically and musically. While I think cancel culture is inherently self-defeating and misguided and have no qualms about anyone talking shit on it, that shit-talking comes quite loudly from two different groups of people, and one of those groups is a little bit louder and a whole lot worse. It's by no means Taylor's responsibility to ensure that her music is closed to interpretation or incapable of being misconstrued. In fact, her very best music is often those things. But I can't shake the feeling that this track is particularly open to being co-opted by the very worst kinds of people. And so I just found myself wishing there was something in these lyrics that would have served as a sort of ward to that happening, but I couldn't really find anything like that. And in an era where even Rage Against the Machine has been misconstrued as a conservative anthem, you really should be a bit careful about that if that's something that you're trying to avoid. And beyond that, it just feels like the track on the record that fits the least into the overall themes of the album. There are threads there for sure, I just mentioned a few of them, but I'd argue that even like Actually Romantic weaves into those themes a little bit more tightly than this one does. Musically, as a big fan of the aesthetics of Reputation, this song feels like the closest thing we've gotten to that since that record came out, which makes sense thematically, and it makes sense because Taylor's working with Max and Chill back again too. The first two bars of the chorus are super sticky, one of the catchier hooks on the record, though I do think the chorus kind of tapers off a little bit. If that "they're the ones with matching scars" line hit harder for me, I'd probably feel differently about that. It seems like it's meant to be one of those quiet bites, like it's meant to come in like a little sizzling whispered sting to really send the message home, but that line is a really good example of a certain kind of theatricality across this song that, much like how Haunted just doesn't work so well for me, I personally struggle with. It walks a little too close to campiness for my taste, and I can only get so invested in it before I'm like, this is all a bit overly dramatic, right? The overall effect is this song kind of straddles that line for me, with parts of it working really well and parts of it tipping just a bit too far on the other side for my taste. And on the whole, I think I probably regard it as the weakest on the record by just some slim margin, with a large personal taste asterisk attached. Honey returns us back to several of the themes and tropes that have largely been a through line on this album, namely contrasting Taylor's experiences before and after her current relationship, here framed around the transformation of Taylor's instinctual responses to being talked to in certain ways or called certain things which had previously made her defensive and skeptical and cynical, and which now suddenly feel endearing. Much as she refers to having been locked in a tower in the opener or having been caught off guard in Wishlist, it seems that in her current relationship, being called lovely or honey or sweetheart provoked a kind of self-protection impulse, reminding her of this list of bad experiences that she details across the verses and choruses here. Snarky, passive-aggressive people or former love interests who weren't actually invested in their relationships. And this new relationship has made her stop and go, wait, you're actually being nice to me? And that's kind of heartbreaking in its implications. And that heartbreak mostly skirts by unnoticed by the overall tone of this song, which is really groovy and fairly upbeat, right up until the final pre-chorus. When the instrumentation drops away, Taylor's delivery softens, and the track affords the listener a chance to go, oh, actually, that's kind of awful that you felt that way. But just to soften that blow, that moment really only serves to make the final chorus that much more triumphant when it drops. Taylor scattered a few lyrical homages throughout this song that seemed to me to be hinting at previous relationships, which perhaps helped to establish these guarded instincts, like "I cried the whole way home," which is a direct quote from Dear John, a possible double meaning to "forever nightstand" or "forever nightstand," the latter having previously been referenced on Delicate, the pink skies of Invisible String, and most notably the constant thread of the color blue, which is woven through virtually every record since Red, here having been redefined by her new partner. I also can't help but notice the ways in which each verse contains a little run of notes which seem incredibly reminiscent of the London Boy Bridge, beginning with "Honey, I'm home" and "Sweetie, it's yours." That theme here of rewriting, reframing, and recontextualizing her past experiences in light of her current relationship seems to me to possibly extend not just to the lyrics but to the music itself, reclaiming and redefining pieces of it for her current self. Also, quick aside, the way Taylor's voice bends upward on the "what's the plan" and "your eyes," is that not incredibly reminiscent of something missing, I think, from Midnight's. I cannot place it. Someone please tell me what that is. Anyway, this track has really solid production and songwriting, nothing that I'm inclined to knock, though I do think it's maybe on the slightly weaker side of the record on the whole. It's very smooth, and it reminds me of some of the silkiest moments from Midnight's or even some 90s R&B here again, but the choruses and verses don't really have particularly significant musical variation between them. That driving electronic drum beat and gentle, slightly melancholic piano just kind of coast through both of them. The "you can call me honey if you want, because I'm the one you want," that kind of feels like it's the core refrain of the song, but it's curiously in the verses rather than the choruses. And all of that kind of combines to make me feel like there aren't really strong standout choruses on this track. What does stand out on this track, though, are the post-choruses, brief as they may be. There's a total change up in vocal delivery every time they hit, but when Taylor goes into the "but you," the first one brings up this dancing bass line into the mix, and the second one combines this beautiful little piano sequence with this warm clarinet that lingers for just a few notes, and I really, really love the instrumentation there, and I found myself really wishing that it hung around for longer, because it adds this almost jazzy spice to the track, and I think it could have only benefited from more of that. On the whole, Cancelled and Honey pair up to be kind of the low point of the record for me, but not really by very much. Neither of them are skips, and either of them could have been a standout track on some of the earlier records of hers. If I had to admit what my personal hopes were for this album, as much as I try not to go in with any expectations or desires and just let the album be what it's going to be, my dream version of this record was one which really leaned into the storytelling of a showgirl, like folklore or evermore, autobiography woven into character portraits and narratives. And here, at the very end of the record, on the title track no less, we do finally get precisely that. The closing track of the album takes us on a journey through two lives, the established showgirl and her forewarned but inevitable successor. Much like Father Figure, there's a perspective switch here from protege to kind of grizzled veteran, although in this one it's a bit more explicitly built into the narrative itself. Taylor, and very probably Sabrina, who Taylor specifically selected to feature on this track, can surely relate to both being apprised of the downsides of entering into and attempting to move up through the world of show business, but also, in their turn, being sought after and idolized by possibly naive young performers aspiring to achieve the things that they have, saying, "You're living my dream," and they likely have found themselves echoing those same warnings which were once given to them, and they likely know that those warnings may not be heeded. And just from the get-go, that's the kind of narrative hook that I'm all about. I think Taylor's writing is frequently at its best when she uses prose-like, descriptive storytelling, and those brief lines delivered by Sabrina describing the successor as the child of this waspy upper-class family, a whoring father, and a pill-popping, tennis-playing mother, that's a perfect example of the painting with words imagery that I'm always drawn to in Taylor's writing. We also get another little tie to Father Figure here with a reference to selling one's soul, the archetypal deal with the devil, just before the biggest punch of the track with, "But that's not what showgirls get, they leave us for dead," recalling countless examples over Taylor's discography like The Lucky One or Clarabelle, wherein women are strapped to ticking time bombs from the moment they step into the spotlight. And I'd be remiss not to mention the bridge into the final modified chorus, which really feels like it contains the kind of core truth of this track, as sung from the perspective of two women who knew what they were getting into and took the deal anyway, and who know that there are successors who would do anything to get them out of their way, but who are immortal now and who couldn't if they tried. Pain hidden by the lipstick and lace, sequins are forever and wouldn't have it any other way, serve as declarations on the part of both of them that they are cut out for this. They're built to handle this industry that demolishes so many others on their way to the top. They can suffer through the slings and arrows and keep dancing and smiling. And the listener, particularly I think if the listener is someone who themselves aspires in any way to be like Taylor or like Sabrina, is left with these two conflicting feelings of, that really does seem glamorous and cool, and wow, these two are badasses, and yet also they're telling me that it's going to require burying my pain behind a smile and having ice in my veins. And in so doing, the listener is essentially invited into the same cycle themselves. And I love when Taylor goes bittersweet, and that is nothing if not bittersweet. And musically, it's also one of my very favorite tracks on the record. First, Sabrina just blends into the song absolutely seamlessly. A more perfect feature match one could not possibly hope for. I love her delivery on all of her lines here. She understood the assignment 100%. The core melody is one that's reminiscent of several songs I've heard before. I think the earliest one that I can place is Michael Jackson's Will You Be There? Does anyone remember that song? And in addition to being really catchy, the chord progression has this real inherent warmth to it, helped by the kind of stomp clap percussion that feels very rounded on the edges compared to a lot of the percussion on this record. And then the whole instrumentation and melody completely swap out for this incredibly colorful, almost Broadway musical-esque bridge, where the vocal cadence kicks into double time, the clapping percussion is matched with these bouncing strings that kind of pull the momentum faster and faster, until it drops into this twinkling, theatrical piano that Taylor sends off with this kind of cabaret nightclub vocal turn. Despite what I may have just said about having a low tolerance for explicit theatricality regarding Cancelled, this particular flavor of it works really well for me, and I think it serves as a perfect complement to the showgirl Showgirl theme. It immediately transports us into this smoke-filled lounge with Taylor laid atop a piano, mic in one gloved hand, 12-inch cigarette holder in the other, and then playing out the song with the distant roar of a crowd and Taylor and Sabrina thanking the audience for attending is just a perfect cherry on top. Just when I was a little bit concerned that I'd feel like the record tapered off towards the end, they really stuck the landing here, and this track is one of my favorites on the album, if not my favorite on the whole record. While Life of a Showgirl may not be my favorite record of her career, I do think it largely succeeds in being what it set out to be, which is a collection of really addictive songs, cleanly and neatly packaged with very little in the way of excess or bloat, and songs that punch above their lyrical class for your typical pop banger. That might seem something a bit shy of real high praise, but it's also a bang-on summary for how I feel about 1989 or Reputation, which are the two albums in Taylor's catalog which I think this one most closely resembles, both in intention and in result. Neither of those records have my very favorite lyrics of Taylor's career, but both of them have some really good ones, and both of them have some of the catchiest bops she's ever made, and both of them have really fun, diverse production. All of that is equally true of The Life of a Showgirl. While my dream version of this record might have been Evermore, but it's about a showgirl, I never really thought that's what I was going to get. From the time Travis declared it an album of bops and it was announced that Max and Shellback had produced it, it was just never going to be that record. It's not my dream Taylor record, but neither was the Tortured Poets Department, and I think that's the best of her career. Here's what this record is, though. It's an exploration of the ways in which Taylor sees her life having diverged completely from a path which it had been taking for many years, perhaps decades up until this point. Her current relationship, engagement, is repeatedly framed in stark contrast to the pessimistic, fatalistic, doomed path of prophecy down which she had been falling. There are two Taylors on this record. The first is the Shakespearean tragic heroine, cursed by fate and prophecy, this highly scrutinized public figure with countless failed relationships, a heartbroken girl with perpetual black skies over her head, the eldest daughter putting on a facade of strength and power, pretending not to care about criticisms to protect her heart, someone who learns to dodge compliments and kindness for fear of them being insults in disguise, an upstart singer-songwriter who's about to get burned by her record label and who's been warned about the industry by her idols. And then there's a second Taylor, who is soft, and vulnerable, and head over heels in love, and head over heels in love with her job, and she owns her power without letting it own her. And don't get me wrong, the second Taylor is not entirely new. We've seen glimpses of her before on previous records. But what's new is the clear delineation. There's been this clean break. Depending on how you read the second track, apart from maybe that caveat, there's virtually no anxious energy on this record. There's no anxiety, there's no fear. The tragedies and regrets and pain and heartbreak are all in the past tense, all presented as merely necessary contrasts, like the dark velvet cushion that you place a diamond on so that the light can reflect from it unobstructed. There's this unqualified, unmitigated quality to Taylor's happiness on this record that really can only be properly appreciated through the contradistinction with everything that came before it. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be worth mentioning the stuff that came before it, because none of that seems to be who she is now. And while the record does largely focus on Taylor's love life, there was more going on behind the scenes over the past year or two, friends facing public scrutiny, finally reclaiming her masters and putting that whole fiasco to bed, and undoubtedly going through considerable emotional and physical difficulties while performing for nearly 4 hours with practically no breaks, with a show every, 4 days on average over 2 years? And I think we get a little bit of all of that here too, in ways which cleverly make use of the same theme of contrasting two versions of herself, which helps bind the whole record together surprisingly well, and which delivers on that behind-the-curtains promise that was made for the album. Overall, this is a project, much like every Taylor record, that I'm going to be coming back to again and again, and one about which my feelings are going to surely sway over time. I'm only a few days removed from the album's release. I know that at least one of these songs is going to really grow on me, and I'll realize something about another one that's going to make me go, damn it, why didn't I mention that? And slowly this record is going to intertwine into the vast interconnected tapestry of Taylor's musical corpus, and will inevitably be viewed totally differently through the lenses of time and the records to come. But I've got some fresh Taylor bops right now. I'm going to be blasting those in the car, and you are going to hear me complaining about that. For my sake, I hope this record only continues to grow on me, and for Taylor's sake, I hope it really does prove to be, years down the line, reflective of the true clean breaking of the prophecy that she believes it is, and that the long threads of heartbreak which ran from her very first album through the next 10 have all been knotted off, and from here on out, it's all golden.